after the fact, and anyone who likes the link to the Sfaria text is in the chat section. And where we're at is, we'll dive right in, because there's an actual fact, and let's forget this. Anyone who likes, we will hit. Really sound like that. We're going to start on page 32 if you're looking on the Koran. This is page 6b. If you're in the Sfaria, if you're looking online, it's page 6b, paragraph I think 7 is what it is. And before we start, one last thing of housekeeping before we start. We'll send out another email of it tomorrow. But if you want to sell your chametz to me, or need a link to the Passover guides for this year, or a link to the siyum for the Tanit Brachot for the Fast of the Firstborn next week, those are all available at rabbiselzberg.blogspot.com. All right. Brachot for Torah study is Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. And we're going to hit something fun today. It'll take a short amount of time to get there, but we're going to hit what, as far as famous passages in the Talmud go, will be a famous passage in the Talmud. I'll be curious to find out just how famous. But where we're going to start now is, I think it's paragraph 7, page 6b, which is the bottom of page 32. The bottom of page 32. Paragraph 7 in the online. So we're pivoting. Now we're a full week away from when we were talking about theodicy, about why bad things happen to good people. Last week we had issues of prayer, and then a few issues relating to demons. We're going to pivot away from demons, I hate to disappoint, and from black cats, and how to, if you want to see demons, take the afterbirth of a firstborn female black cat, born to a firstborn female black cat, burn it in the fire and grind it, place it in your eyes, and then you'll be able to see demons. Did anyone try it over the course of the last week? No? As a rabbi, I'm saying do try this at home. So yeah, we're going to leave that stuff behind and go into something very different. We're going to talk about prayer. I know, in the volume called Brachot, why would you expect to hear about Brachot? Shouldn't it be about vinegar turning into wine and black cats? And the answer is occasionally we'll talk about actual prayer. This is the stream of consciousness nature of the Talmud. And we got onto some of these odd topics because all of last week was Abba Binyamin quotes from one of the sages. Abba Binyamin started out with the quotes about praying before a wall and next to his bed or in front of his bed. And then there was an issue of where and when you pray, if you're like in a city, and that and leaving somebody alone sort of like got us to demons. And now we're going to have another Abba Binyamin quote, which is very different and a little more relevant to us. I hope. Tanya, bottom of page 32. It was taught in a Braita, again, a quote from the time of the Mishnah that got left on the cutting room floor. Abba Binyamin Omer, he would say, Ein tefillah shel adam nishmat ela beveit hakneset. A person's prayer is not heard unless it's in the synagogue. Thank you, good night. Make sure everyone you know knows this fact. They're usually more concerned with this Beit HaMidrash, with the study hall, than the synagogue. But this is a great one. I think the next time we put up a plaque, and you always need like a Torah quote on the plaque, I feel like this should be it. Or we'll set it on top of the dues statements or just like have it on the letterhead. Your prayer is not heard unless it is in a synagogue. So know this. A little extreme. We'll narrow it down in a moment, but it's a great quote. Shana Amar, they often will want a backup for it. So how do you know this? Because it says, with regard to King Solomon's prayer in the temple, this is a quote from Second Book of Kings. They give the fuller quotes. There's just a short quote in the Hebrew. Lishmoa el arina va'ala tefila. V'makom rina sham tziyei tefila. So the full quote is, when Solomon is dedicating the temple, when Melech Shlomo is dedicating the temple, it says that you have turned towards the prayer of your servant and to his supplication, Lord my God. Listen to the song and the prayer, which your servant prays to you on this day. And the verse then concludes, to hear prayer, your servant directs towards this place. The modern commentary is, we see that one's prayer is heard specifically in the temple, of which the synagogue is a microcosm. It may be inferred in the place of song, synagogue where God's prayers are sung, that prayer should be. But makom rina, in the place of song, sham tziyei tefila, there you'll find prayer. So here the move that they're doing is that God hears Solomon's prayer in the temple. We don't have the temple. We only have synagogues. But if, so what he's learning from that, well, maybe it should be that God hears your prayer in the synagogue, but he sort of one-ups it and says, does the Ein Ela, God only hears your prayer in the synagogue. Incredible line. Pause. Response, thoughts? The line there that's quoted, you may be familiar with from the High Holidays. The quote from the Book of Kings is Lishmoa el arina va'ala tefila, right? And there's a piyut on, I feel like Yom Kippur. I can't remember exactly where it appears, but I'm getting a Yom Kippur feeling. Anyone want to back me up on this?
What about the idea that God could be anywhere? Okay, he's more receptive in the temple, is closer to the temple, and he's closer to his synagogue. But does that mean that if you pray any place else, your prayers are of no value?
Your prayers, no value. Don't even bother. No, I don't think he's saying that. Though you could read it that way. He obviously doesn't mean that, right? Meaning that would be an even more extreme statement. I think relatively frequently they'll use lines like this to underline importance. And you see, like the translator puts the word fully in there to try and make that point, to try and walk it back. But this is, but every so often they're going to say things that are in the style of which that people will often talk, which is to say, somebody might, you're, I don't know, somebody will say to you, you never listen to me. They don't mean you never listen to me. They mean too frequently, I feel like you're not listening. You always say that. Doesn't mean you say nothing that's not that. It means you say that too frequently. So this, when he says prayer is only heard in the synagogue, it means in modern parlance, like you get more, I got more bars there. I got better, the reception is better there. That seems to be what he's saying. Because it would be a stretch for him to say otherwise, given given the fact that we've done tons of stuff where guys are praying in ruins, guys are praying on the side of the road, guys are praying, right? But it is a big pro-synagogue statement, of which there are not many. But this is one of them. Next, Amar Ravin. Baravada, Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, Minayin, Shakadosh Baruch Hu, Matzui Veda Knesset, Shenamar, Elohim Nitzav Vedatel. What is it? So, sort of like leaping off on this, it really is God like more in synagogue than God is anywhere else, more in the Beit Knesset than somewhere else. Ravin Bar Abba said that Rabbi Yitzchak said, where do we know that Kadosh Baruch Hu is, they translate, located in a synagogue? Matsui B'Veit Knesset, sort of like it is found in the synagogue or can be found in the synagogue. Why? Because we've got this quote from Psalms, beginning of the Psalm for Tuesday. God stands in the congregation of God. In the midst of the judges, he judges. The beginning of that Psalm, Psalm 82, God stands in the congregation of God. They're reading as, what's the congregation of God? That's a synagogue. Half of them are called Bethel, right? The congregation of God is a synagogue, and we have a psalm that says God stands in the congregation of God. So there you are. We've got a proof text that God hangs out in synagogues. By the way, that psalm, which again, like you can find in the Siddur as a psalm for Tuesday, or in any, Tanakh as Psalm 82, that first line, Elohim Nitzav Be'edat El, God sits in the congregation of God. And most scholars assume that this isn't what they're saying. They're reading Adat El as the congregation of God, like as a synagogue. When the Psalms were written, there weren't synagogues, obviously. So what's Adat El? What does God stands in Adat El? If you read that whole Psalm, it seems that God is chairman of the board, and other lesser lowercase g gods is like the maximal way of putting it, but like at the very least other divine beings are sort of like around the boardroom table, as it were, and God stands in the congregation of God, is like the congregation of gods, as it were. That is an early psalm from when, like, Mi chamocha be'elim Adonai, who is like you among the gods, God. It's one of those things like that where they're acknowledging other gods. They're just lesser, not all that effective. There's only one real one. Sort of a line from the pre-monotheistic period of Jewish life. Great psalm, great line, Psalm 82. So anyway, where are you going to find God? At Shul. That's where God is. You find some other people there, but God too. Minayin. Now we're going to get one that this next little section is going to be almost directly from Pirkei Avot. It appears very similarly in Pirkei Avot. Minayin she'asara mipalelin shechinah imechem shenamar Elohim nitzav be'edat el. Oh, by the way, how do we know that when 10 people pray together, when there are 10 people together, a minyan, that the divine presence is with them, the Shekhinah, God's presence in this world is with those 10? Well, because it says in that psalm, this is why we're going off on this old tangent, another thing associated with the first line of Psalm 82, it says God stands in the congregation of God, right? What's a congregation? What's an Edah? That's 10, right? 10, how do we know that 10 is a congregation? Well, because in the story of the spies, the people, 12 go and scout out the land. They come back. 2 of them, Yoshua and Caleb, say that the land is great. We should go and continue on. And 10 of them say, we'll never do it. That they're too big. This won't succeed. We should just go back to Egypt. And God then says, how long will this Edah, this congregation, rebel against me? So the rabbis say, God says that an Edah, a congregation, is referring to these 10. So what's an Edah? 10. A congregation, Edah, is 10. So this is, so that's the source.
In that case, isn't congregation a negative word? And you wouldn't want to, is God always showing up at negative places?
That we're not going to put on the do statement. Yes, that's what's amazing about it, is that they learn it from this terrible, like that's the part where they get cursed to wander for another 38 years. None of the other sins get them the wandering punishment except for that one. So yeah, they're doing it despite despite the negative context. There's one other spot where there's a reference to 10 and congregation, I think in Genesis, but the main one they use is that one.
Yeah, isn't it Abraham negotiating with God for
Right.
saving Sodom and Gomorrah?
He stops at 10, but he doesn't associate it with Edah. So the reason why the one in Numbers, why the scout story is the one that they use, is because there we have 10 and the word Edah, congregation. So, and then we have the Abraham story as a nice support for that. Abraham stops at 10. Why does he stop at 10? Well, the Torah doesn't say, but because we've learned that 10 is sort of like the minimum number to have a congregation over here, now we understand that Abraham must have stopped at 10, that below 10, you're just sort of like a group of individuals. Once you're 10, you're like cohere as a kahal. So the Abraham story, thank you, Ed, is a good support for it, but you need the numbers story to make it work. That too, by the way, negative, right? That the Stone story obviously is a negative story as well. Anyway, this is so, and then the so God stands in the congregation of God. So what's Edah? Edah. God stands with an Edah, with 10. When they're 10 there, God is with them, and they learn it right from the psalm. I mean, you know, we have these, so it's something of a trick shot, but not much. Next one. Ooh, me nine. Now that we have a, we're going to keep going similar vein. Me nine, shosha, shoshvim, badin, shechinayim achem, shenamar, b'chriv Elohim yishpot. From where do we know that when we just said 10, when 3 sit in judgment, meaning a court of judges is made up of at least 3, that the Shekhinah, the God's divine presence of the world, is with them. How do we know that? Because it says that in the very next line of that psalm is, in the midst of God, of judges, he judges. So after that first line, which is God send the congregation of God, so that's 10. And then in 3, it says, in the midst of judges, he judges. And so at the minimum number they need for a case are 3 judges. So this is how they learn it. By the way, this is apropos of what I said earlier. What they're translating as judges here is the word Elohim. Now, it is true, Elohim occasionally means judges, but Elohim also can mean God, and frequently does, as almost always does, right? We say Elohim all the time. Eloheinu melech, like this is all the time. It occasionally means judges, and this is, so they have to read it as judges. But if you remember, the first one is God stands in the congregation of God, and in the midst of judges, he judges. It really, like, you could say that God stands in the congregation of gods, and with the gods he judges, right? Like, so there are a few different ways of reading this, and one of them, which is very close to the words, is very heretical. They're not reading it that way, but that's part of what makes Psalm 82 totally fascinating. Anyway, God dwells with 3, with 3 who are judging. Like when this, by the way, is no small thing, right? If you want to say this out, it's not just that God dwells with a minion when a minion or more prays, right? Like that's in itself a deeply spiritual sense, right? Like that when 10 to get together to pray, they're calling God's presence into their presence. And essentially, almost like a person might say, well, if they're not going to get a minion, I'm not going to show up. they're almost saying God rolls the same way. If they're not getting a minyan, I'm not going to show up. But if there is a minyan, God says, I will stand with them. And this is, again, there's no individual halachic requirement to have a minyan. But when you do have a minyan, again, here's the sense that God is with you, right? Let me think. This is
Rabbi, did you just say there's no halakha requirement for a minyan?
for the individual, meaning your obligation is fulfilled. Your obligation to daven is fulfilled by your obligation is fulfilled by by davening alone. The community is obligated to have a minyan. The individual is not.
Rabbi, can you have 9 in the Torah? Does that count too?
Only if the Torah is a human being. No. No. You can find people who do that. You can also find halakhic writings dating back centuries of saying, for God's sake, no. You can have 9 people and an 11-year-old, but you can't have 9 people on the Torah. And I would say for so one, like the halakha on that one is pretty clear. For me, the importance of that one is that we live in a world where there are people who think that their holy books are more important than human beings, and that's part of why I like to drive home the message that, important though it may be, the Torah is not a person, and we have to keep it in its place, as it were.
Rabbi, why is it necessary then for some prayers, like the Kaddish, to have a minyan?
So it's sort of derived from that. Actually, so you can't learn it from why it isn't directly here, but you can infer part of it from what we just read. I mean, look at that. When 10 pray together, then God is standing with you, right? There's sort of you see that there's a unique and special status. And you'll see we're going to play with numbers over the course of this page, but that there's a sense of 10, again, being the minimum for a congregation, and that for something to be thought of as a public declaration, there needs to be 10 present. That's why I usually don't like the English word quorum. Every so often they'll translate minyan as prayer quorum. But that's sort of the place where one can maybe best understand it. We can't do that at the meeting tonight. We don't have a quorum. Well, what does that mean? Well, we have a number. Once we fall below that number, we're not enough of us for all this stuff to really take hold. And there, the idea of minyan is sort of there too, with 10, God is with you, and there's enough there for a quorum, that these things are taking hold in a public sense, and that's not true of less than that. You just need a cutoff point, and that's the cutoff point.
What about women? I mean, can they never pray, or is a different rule for women?
You're asking, obviously, in the context of the Talmud, as opposed to in the context of now. So notice they're not bringing it up, right? They're actually, the Talmud never actually will go out of its way to say men, as opposed to people. I think it's safe to assume they meant men and not people, but they never say it. The short answer to your question is, of course, women can pray, and of course they have to. In the halakha, as say Orthodox Jews understand it, generally speaking, is women are obligated to pray every day. They're not obligated to the statutory prayers, meaning the obligatory Shachrit, Mincha, Mariv, morning Shema, morning Amidah, things like this. Why not? Because we get to some point, women are exempt from a handful of mitzvot, and they will define those as being positive time-bound mitzvot, things that you're obligated to do at a specific time. So it's not about women can't or shouldn't. It's in the traditional halacha, it's framed as women are not obligated to statutory prayer. If that answers the question. Here, though, again, and they'll never say men. They, to my knowledge, they never say men. They, but I think it's safe to say you can assume it. Women in place of men here, I don't think so much enters their consciousness. It's not a category they think of. Others?
Yeah, well, in the past, I heard what the reason is that some of these are time bound, and women just didn't have that liberty to just regulate their time because it depended on children and whatever that was.
Right. That's a positive time-bound commandment. Right. So that's that indeed is the reason cited. It's obviously ridiculous because occasionally you have people who have women who live without children around, who are pre or post that point in their lives or don't have that point in their lives, and you have men who are obligated for childcare. Yeah. So obviously, logically, it doesn't work, and the signature commandment traditionally placed on women is that of Shabbat candles, which is nothing but positive and time bound. So logically, it's easy to poke holes in it, but that's the big idea behind it. Weiter, we'll keep going. Third one, Minai. From where? This is now, if you're in the Sfaria, this is paragraph 11, and in the and on page 33 in the text, it's 1, 2, 3, 4 paragraphs down. L'shnaim sheyoshvin v'oskim b'Torah shechina imachem shene'amar az nidvu yirei Adonai ish el re'ehu v'yikshiva Adonai v'domrei. So where do we learn that even two who sit and engage in Torah study, that the Shekhinah, the divine presence, is with them, because it says, then they that feared the Lord spoke one with the other, and the Lord listened and heard, and a book of remembrance was written before him for they that feared the Lord and that think upon his name. When people speak one with the other, well, that would be a minimum of two if two people are speaking together, and the Lord listened. So if two people are studying Torah, talking Torah to each other, God's there listening, right? Listening on the conversation. So here we have 10 davening, 3 judging, 2 studying. God is with them in each of these things, and they bring lines for each of them. And again, what's the point of this? Is God really there or something like that? Well, maybe, but it seems that the point of it is these ways when you're calling holiness into existence, calling God into your space, creating holy space where where you feel that larger presence. They're for prayer, that's 10. For judging, that's 3, and for studying, that's 2. But also, there's a sense of know the weight of what's going on. And again, I often want to use our human leaders for this, right? If the queen walks in the room, you choose your words carefully. I know we've learned that some people in the royal family apparently aren't choosing their words carefully, but if the queen is listening, you'll choose your words carefully. If the president is listening, you choose your words carefully, right? If anyone's listening, you choose your words carefully, right? So this is also that, how would you daven with a minyan knowing that God is with you?
Rabbi?
And then same with judging. Judge knowing that God is with you when you judge.
But given how
Rabbi, I
with it,
find this.
Wait, Stephen first, then Alan.
Oh, so
okay.
I find this really an interesting section in that it seems to me to emphasize the traditional importance on study that is associated with Judaism. And secondly, the traditional Talmudic approach of arguing, debating, engagement with someone else in order to enhance the study experience.
Yes. Yeah. Notice now, by the way, like not to spoil, but the next one's going to go down to 1. But then it's going to temper that. But yes. So, and you notice that these things, the prayer, sure, of course, prayer, and like it's sort of like you see the foundations of like where minyan becomes so central Jewishly here, right? Like you sort of see that there, but judging also like this idea, and so like that in that second one, the importance of law and of judging rightly, that judges who do their job right, God is with them, and that's a thing. Like, and then here again, the two that God that again, like staying in your head, you're more likely to, it's what we say if you're too in your own head, right? Like that to really discover the truth of what's out there, you need to talk it out with somebody. And in modern times, this will have, like our society finds a different way to deal with this. But it's exactly, I think you're right, Stephen, like exactly what you say. This, Alan.
Well, I was going to say, why wouldn't they carry this down to 1? But apparently that's going to be answered in the
next thing, right?
So, chapters. Yeah, next few lines.
Yeah, exactly, right. So the next paragraph, my lo shivi shmo, like what does it mean? The end of that line says to think upon his name, to think upon God's name. Amar Rav Ashi says, if a person intended to perform a mitzvah, but due to circumstances beyond his control, he did not perform it, the verse ascribes to him credit as if he performed the mitzvah, as he is among those who think upon God's name. Doesn't really hold up. Amar Rav Ashi, chashav adam la'asot mitzvah. If you think about doing the mitzvah and you like, v'nim'as v'lo asa'ah, but like something happens beyond your control and you can't do it. This is sort of like you say, I'm gonna call Chaim Yankel and invite him over for Shabbos dinner back when you could do this, and like then suddenly you get like 10 work calls and you don't get to do it. Like you still get points for it. Or if you're like, I want to go visit somebody in the hospital, you can do these things, and it was traffic was held me up for twice as long as it could. I never actually got the chance to do it. Like they're saying like in the big ledger in the sky, the big books that we talk about, you get that point, even though you never followed, even though you weren't able to follow through, because you like intended to do it, and for circumstances beyond your control, didn't get to do it, you get credit for thinking it. That's what they're getting from thinking on God's name. So this is a nice one and can help assuage some guilt. If for some reason you intend to do something and actually hold up from it, the Talmud here is saying it's the thought that counts.
I have 2 observations about this one.
Yes.
First, the first one is this concept of asking. Actually, all of the previous ones are the same format. A question is asked and the answer is given. From where did it derive? And then there's an answer.
Right. Good.
And it's not attributed to anybody. This one here, Rav Ashi said. Right. So that caught my attention because I was wondering about the previous ones.
Right. The previous ones could. That's good. That's a great observation. Those could all be under the umbrella of the top. If you're looking at the book at the top of page 33, that's all under Ravin Bar Ava said that Rabbi Yitzchak said, from where is it derived that the Holy One blessed be is located in the synagogue. Like it could all be under that umbrella. But you're right. Here, this is a different thing where they just quoted this verse and they're pulling in somebody else who does something with this verse.
Mm-hmm. So that was one observation. The other one is the answer that Rav Ashi gives seems to be a complete non sequitur to me to the question. being asked.
I agree. Thinking on his name, I agree. I mean, and I think maybe we all do, like his conclusion. It feels like a very like affirming conclusion. Don't feel guilty you didn't get to do it. God knows your intent. Baruch Hashem, right? It's really, it's sort of nice that way. But it's hard to get that out of, to think upon his name. They that feared the Lord spoke with one another, and the Lord listened and heard. And a book of remembrance was written before him for them that fear the Lord and think upon his name. Yeah, that think, he's getting at that. So I'll try and figure this out. If the word that he's doing that there's the book of remembrance was written before him, which again has resonance for us, as people who love the high holidays. For those that fear God and think upon his name, the book of remembrance is open for those who think upon his name. So what's his move here? Why is it not a non sequitur? Is the book of remembrance is open for those that think upon his name. You'd expect it to say who do stuff. You'd expect it to say, oh, the book of remembrance, that's for doers. That's for closers. You close on the mitzvah, you get into the book. Here it says, and think upon his name. So he's like, well, that's weird. Aren't we supposed to be doing stuff? What could it mean? It means that if you think about doing something but are unavoidably detained, book of remembrance comes. So I think that's a good observation, because I hadn't put that all together until you asked.
So I'm feeling better about my procrastination.
Yeah, well, I don't think he's put it.
I know.
This is I ran out of battery. This is like something, like whatever, like this is something that's sort of like beyond your control, or something like yet more important came up. But it's nice.
My dog ate my homework.
Yeah, it's that in the literal sense of it, meaning that your dog actually ate your homework. God as teacher would give credit. Back to it. I want to keep moving. And from where do we learn that even one who sits and studies Torah, that busies himself with Torah, that the Shekhinah, the divine presence, is with him? It's because it says, "B'chol makom asher azkir et shmi avo elech v'irchatecha." Because it says in the book of Exodus, this is the end of the 10 Commandments, and every place where I cause my name to be mentioned, I will come to you and bless you. Anywhere God's name is mentioned, so even if I'm alone and I'm studying Torah, God will come to me. So, Baruch Hashem, even one. So now, if you fans of the Talmud will know where this is going to go next. So again, this is actually nice for Ed's initial question at the beginning of the evening. Like what? Like God only hears you in synagogue. You see how they've sort of walked that back. Doing anything Torah, intending to do anything Torah, all good. But now they're going to ask a question. Well, wait a minute. If you knew that God's presence would dwell with one, why are you teaching me about two? You didn't need to teach me about two. Because if God dwells with one, then guess what? I know that God dwells with two. You don't need, you could have saved your breath. It's like, well, why do you teach 10 and not 11, 12, or 13? And the answer is obvious. Well, if it's 10, it's also true of 13 and 15, right? And 248. So they're saying, if you knew one, why did you teach? Why not just say the one? Why did you need to teach the two? Answer: Trey miktavin elu b'sefer zichronot. Chad lo miktavin b'sefer zichronot. No, because in the verse for two, it says that the words are written in the Book of Remembrance, as Sefer Zichronot, and with one, it's not written that. So yeah, God will come to one, but two, it's it's a higher level. So we needed to teach both. because there is a difference between 1 and 2. God's there, but there's an extra bonus for being in for 2 people studying. And this is to Steve's earlier point that yeah, I mean, don't not study because you're studying alone, but know that 2 is a superior way of doing it.
What is the Book of Remembrance? Is it something God keeps, or
excellent question. Well, let's check here. Hopefully they have a note on the side. And if you're looking in the full edition on the side of page 33, under note, it says, and there's 2 words of Torah written in the Book of Remembrance, despite the Mishnah. And this was in Mishnah Pirkei Avot, beginning of the 2nd chapter. It says that all of your actions are written in a book. Specifically, 2 people engaged in Torah study are written in a Book of Remembrance because an individual studies alone may fail to ascertain the true meaning of the Torah, right? And this is a sense of that 2 people talking things out. Again, you're not in your own head. Like every so often, I certainly, to get an idea right, have to say it out loud. And whether or not I need the other person to respond or not, sometimes yes, sometimes no. Sometimes I just need to say it out loud to make sure that it makes sense. And I can't say it to an empty room. I need to say it to someone. And the same thing for Torah study, right? And this is, Marjorie can chime in. Like, I feel like this is not unique to Torah. This is, I think, a good medical and psychological fact, right? Saying things out loud to another, helpful. People can get fancy degrees in this. So it's not. That's not just modern. That obviously I think it's true and is onto something. Therefore, his words are not to be fit to be recorded in the Book of Remembrance before God. This is less likely when 2 people sit and study, as presumably at least one of them will arrive at a true understanding. Thereby, his counterpart, who was mistaken, will also have played a role in arriving at a correct conclusion. Therefore, his words will also be written before God under the rubric of Torah study. So that's their read of it. That's one answer. I don't know. So what's the Book of Remembrance there? The Book of Remembrance there is sort of like true Torah. The other place it appears, and we'll just give a quick quote of it, what they're referring to from the beginning of Pirkei Avot. People who get up early on Saturday morning will know this. Ponder 3 things to avoid committing a transgression. Keep in mind what is above you, an eye that sees, an ear that hears, and a book in which all your deeds are recorded. Right, and that's not called the Book of Remembrance. That's just called Sefer, a book. But that's what they're referencing there, and the sense of, and that's obviously the source of the tradition that all your deeds are recorded in a book.
Rabbi, just an FYI, if you highlight, you mentioned the commentary in the book, in the hard copy book. If you highlight the online version of what you're talking about, a whole commentary and references come up on the side panel.
Right. So what does that? So for this,
you know, people may. It's interesting. Some of them are very interesting. Some of them are a little,
Right. So this is Sfaria again. Totally, it's awesome. In this, and the idea is obviously just that you bring that all of this becomes accessible. Let's see, for this one, if you go to commentary, do they have stencils? Yeah. They under stencils they sort of bring it, but it's in this, but they bring it in Hebrew. But yeah, so there's a lot there, and like the sheets, there's a lot on the side there when you click on it, and it really does well. And again, it'll link you to the Torah verses so that you know it. Right there. I'm going to move on because I want to get to this next. I want to at least get to this next piece. Ki ma'achar de'afilu chad tzrei mivayeh. Oh yeah, I just did that one, right? Since I did one, why do I need 2? Because of the Book of Remembrance. Next prayer, Ki ma'achar. This is or paragraph number 14. This is 3 paragraphs from the bottom on page 33. So since divine presence rests on even 2, why do you need to say 3? They're just going to, you see the thing here, like you're supposed to teach things, you wouldn't believe it, but you're supposed to say things in fewer words and not more. So if God rests with 2, why do you teach me about 3? Klata mivai, why do you teach 3? Mahu detanya, lest you say, Dina shlama ba'almahu, v'lo ate shchina, k'mash malan, the dina name hainu Torah. Lest you say that judgment is merely to keep the peace, and the divine presence doesn't come and rest upon those who sit in judgment, unless they're engaged in Torah study. That therefore they had to teach 3 who judge, meaning they ask, wait a minute, if God rests with 2, why not 3? They're like, well, the 2 is for Torah study. It doesn't say 2 people who are talking about their brackets for the NCAA tournament, God dwells with them. God doesn't necessarily dwell with them. That's just silliness. Like the it's 2 or more for Torah study. So 3, they had to say 3 because judgment is as important as anything else. Lest you say judgment, that's not really holy work. That's just sort of like keep a lid on things. This is it's like being the detention teacher. Like you're just sort of like the judges. It's not a big deal. It's just to keep people in line. No, this is holy work. God dwells with you when you judge. Again, here reverence for sort of like law and the like is part of the tradition. Next question, you could probably guess. Well, since God dwells with 3, why do you need to say 10? This is typical Talmudic questioning. This is almost like a perfect piece where we go from 10 down and then we go 1 up to 10. Why do I need 10? Asra kadma shchina atia tlata ad diathve. Divine presence arrives before a group of 10. It says God stands in the congregation of God, meaning that when the standing is first, by the time the congregation arrives, God's already there. But with the 3, it's not until they sit and start doing it, meaning that there's sort of this sense of when God is almost anxious, as it were, for the davening to start, and God is the first one to show up for minyan. He's the Joe who's there and turns on the lights and things like that early on. God shows up early for minyan, so anxious for it. Judging, it's when you sit down, you're actually doing it. But God is essentially waiting for minyan, which is going to lead to, it's going to be a couple of weeks from now, but it's too important for me to do. There's a great line coming up where it says that if minyan was scheduled and 10 didn't show up, God's like, I was here, where were you? And that's going to happen because of this line. One, it's a wonderful line where like God is, again, people tend to get annoyed when there's no minyan, and like there's this great line of like, so like God too is like, no, I made time out of my busy schedule to show up. Great bit. We're going to pivot to a slightly different topic, so I'm going to pause for a second.
Rabbi,
If you read only the bold, it doesn't seem to make any sense.
Correct.
Is that really all the Hebrew says?
Yes. Yeah. So the literal, without looking at the bold, I'll say, and why is like and since later on you taught that it's even 3, 10. Why 10 before the Shekhinah arrives before 3? Only when they sit. Yes, it's much more terse. That's why the translation looks like this, and you can even see it if you just. I'm sitting back and just looking at the page. You have these like very few Hebrew words And these big English paragraphs, yes. It's filling in the blank. And that's why it's so hard to translate the Talmud. And like you see why modern printing methods are sort of necessary for Talmud translations to make any sense. Because you need to be able to do all these sort of like different things to both indicate what the actual translation is and also to make it comprehensible.
Rabbi?
Yep.
The Book of Remembrance, could that also be from Yom Kippur? Where
Yes.
all of your deeds are written down and you look back on it.
So it definitely could be. Here, it seems to be like that you have maybe Torah worth remembering, because it's when they're studying Torah. Like, is it that you're adding to like the knowledge of God, and so that gets worth being written down? But yeah, obviously we can't hear the Book of Remembrance without thinking of the hours that we've sat listening to some rabbi go on about the Book of Remembrance. Yeah. So yes, it's definitely, certainly in Pirkei Avot, it's that, right? Your deeds are written in a book. Here,
Rabbi?
it may or may not be that. Yeah.
In the translation, actually, it's not. It's the bold print in paragraph 14. There's a difference between them two people. The words of Torah are written in the Book of Remembrance, as it is stated, and a book of remembrance was written. So if you say, to me, the book means there's only one.
Right.
A book means there's more than one.
Right. The Sefer HaZichronot. So again, you could go either way on the Hebrew, of course, because it's not vocalized. But here at least, and I'm not looking at it Tanakh, if I click on it. But here at least it's pointed as a book of the remembrance, right? B'Sefer HaZichronot.
Rabbi,
So
I just looked it up on Wikipedia. And
Ed, you cut out on me at least on my feed, as right when you began to.
it's in Malachi.
Right. Yeah.
And it says that those that feared the Lord were written in the book before the Lord, and that's what the Book of Remembrance was. So it is a book kept by God of your deeds, or so He remembers what you did.
Right. Malachi 3:16. Right. As I'm using this Faria hypertext feature here, as Nivu Yireh Adonai, Ish El Rehu V'Yachshev Adonai V'Yishma V'Ktev Sefer Zichron, Lefanav Yireh Adonai Lo Yashiv Yishma. In this vein, those who revere the Lord have been talking to one another. The Lord has heard and noted it. A scroll. Remember, it's definitely in Malachi. It's definitely a scroll of remembrance, or a book of remembrance, and there's no way you could get it to the. Yeah, it's a. So looking at the commentary that they have here, so that, all right, yeah. So I want to keep going because there's a great bit coming up. But yeah, a book of remembrance. I guess it's at the end there. Well, I'm gonna stop here. Also, yeah, no, this is where we got to call it. So you look forward after Pesach. Then we're gonna get to one of the great things. I was so confident that this part that we spent all night on, we were gonna zip through. I thought that I was gonna read this as fast as it could be read, and that would be a page ahead of where we are, but we're not. What you have to look forward to next time is we're going to start out with God wearing tefillin. God not only shows up at Minyan, but God's got the gear. And the question is going to be, spoiler alert,
which arm?
Which arm? and this is going to be the right arm, is what's written in God's tefillin. So we know that we wear tefillin to remind us of God. So what's God's tefillin? This is you have something to look forward to. This is one of certainly mine, and I think relatively commonly among rabbis in Judaism, beloved passages, which is sort of like the wonderful and wild world of the rabbis, which is that for people out there, probably not for us to a certain degree, but for people out there, tefillin are bizarre and weird. But like they're so normal that not only do we wear tefillin, but like we can't even imagine the idea that God doesn't wear tefillin. Even though God, I know, doesn't have a body, but shows up at shul, wears tefillin. So next time, God's tefillin. Mark off where we are. Adkan, we'll pause here, and again next week we'll take off for Pesach. Need to sell your